Chapter 2, Introduction to Form, Mass, and Line. Alright, so we are now going to be learning about these three major categories and how they will help us see the general style of any given artwork regardless of who the artist is and what time period they were created in. I first learned about these terms from Bill Perkins, who used to be a visual development artist and director at Disney for many years. I took a composition class from him, and even though he went over so many different concepts of design in the 10-week course, this is what stood out to me the most. I've also been able to put these principles into practice after taking an environment sketching course with Ed Lee. And not surprisingly, both Bill and Ed have been working together on many animation projects, as these were some of the guiding principles they used in order to stay consistent with the movies they were working on. And ever since I first learned about these in 2012, I have been constantly exploring and experimenting with these principles. And now, I'm super excited to pass down all this information to you all. So from the beginning, we need to take a look at the first set of artists we did our black and white composition studies from. What these art pieces have in common is that their dominant compositional feature is the separation of light and shadow. Or, another way to look at it is that the main contrast of the image is created by the representation of form. As you can see in the first painting to the left, Rembrandt's subject is being revealed in a certain light. And as we saw from the quick black and white study, the major contrast was created by the difference between the light and shadow. And on the second painting by Mead Schaefer, even though a lot more colors are being shown than the Rembrandt painting, such as the red curtain in the background versus the dark brown suit for the character, the stronger difference is still between the light and shadow. As for the blue painting, even though we see the characters' faces, hands, and costumes, they still have a lower contrast. And again, the main separation, if we were to use just two values, or if we squint our eyes to see the overall design of the composition, we see that it is created by the moonlight and how everything else is in the shadows. And to the right, with Edgar Payne's landscape painting, even more color is introduced here. However, as we saw with our quick black and white study, we can still see that he used the pattern of the light and shadow to create the overall design of his image. So even though there is some contrast between the color of the blue sky versus the orange landscape, when we squint our eyes, the contrast between those two colors are not greater than the contrast of the effect of the sunlight. Next, we'll take a look at how this principle of a form-dominant design is applied to film and video games today. First up, we have the recent Blade Runner 2049, and you can see that the use of light and shadow is the dominant design here for this compositional shot. Second sample is from the movie Alien, definitely one of my all-time favorites, and you can see how everything in the scene is only being shown based on the lighting as well. And interestingly enough, there's another movie that came out the same year, which is Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky. And you can see how the use of light and shadow is created on these men's faces in order to showcase the mood and storytelling point of the scene. And just to round things off, here are some samples from certain video games, such as Half-Life 2, Last of Us, and Battlefield 4. Now, even though they are just screenshots, you can see how the lighting is a big part of the design. In order for them to get a unifying look throughout the entire game, they want to make sure they stay consistent. Next up, Let's take a look back at the studies we did from the second set. Now, in order to properly separate the contrasting values in these compositions, we noticed we had to resort to using more than two values. Now, the reason for that is that the highest amount of differences in the contrast was in the local color or value of each object or parts of a given subject. So if we first take a look at the piece by John Singer Sargent, we notice that the highest contrast was between the outfit, where you have a black part of the outfit and a white area in the front. And you can see that that's also contrasting with the brown background, as well as the subject's face and hair. Now I know there are some shadows in here in order to create some form and depth. However, when you squint your eyes, you'll notice that the shadows almost disappear, which means that the contrast of the light versus shadow is very low. Therefore, the overall design and composition of this image is done so by the local color and value of the subjects. Now, the term that Bill Perkins used in order to showcase what the local value or color is the word mass. So unlike form, mass is describing the local color and value of certain shapes, subject, or other parts within the context of a scene. So when we take a look at Yuan Yuglow's work here, you'll notice that the main thing he's using to design is just large chunks of color. And just like Sargent's work, there's a little bit of shadow in there in terms of showing a little bit of form. However, you hardly notice it even in the beginning. And that's one of the key principles his work is so recognizable, is that the arrangements that he's simplifying his shapes is separated by the different colors. And just like we found out with Bernie's work with all the orange, as monochromatic as the image seems with just mainly orange, you can see that there's some shadows in his face to describe the forms. But if you squint your eyes, that shadow area starts to merge with the background. And then all of a sudden, the highest amount of contrast we see is with the white collar, his face, the hair, and of course, the overall background. And lastly, we did a quick study of the Sicario film. Even though it's live action, and of course they used lighting, we can see in this screenshot that the main separation in terms of composing this shot here is used with local values in mind. You can clearly see the separation of their outfits with their background and other areas of the scene. Let's go ahead and take a look at a few more samples in which the principle of mass was the dominant feature of a design. So first up, we have the animated feature Toy Story 3. And as you can see in this complex scene, the use of color was very vibrant in the shot alone. And it's definitely very common in animation with the use of strong color. That way, when characters are in the scene together, they want to make sure that their shapes and values are contrasting enough that the audience can tell them apart. Now, even though 3D was used with technical lighting in order to render out these forms, you can see that the shadows were purposely subdued so they can become softer and not take away from the scene itself. This moment in the story is also not meant to be scary, so that way, it's bright and colorful with softer lighting. And again, such a complex scene, make sure that we can tell all the characters apart, as this is an important part of the story that introduces several different characters. We can also see this used in the movie Trolls, where each character has very vibrant colors, and in the scene alone, even with some of the shadows on their feet, you can really tell each character apart from each other. However, just like we saw in the Sicario film, there are other live action films that use mass as a principle even throughout a whole movie. So for this sample, we have Grand Budapest Hotel, where the use of color was very vibrant throughout the whole film, just like an animated feature. And that's one of the main principles that Wes Anderson uses in a lot of his films in order to tell a story. And that brings us to our third element of style, which is line. As we saw by doing this Muka study, things were pretty straightforward, and we drew out the lines in order to capture the general readability of the image. This is probably the easiest to comprehend out of the other two elements, as it's fairly self-explanatory. Since we only saw one sample though, let's take a look at a few more with the use of line as an element. First up, we have a drawing by Frank Frazetta. And as you can see here, if you do a study of this just like the Muka drawing, it will have very similar properties. However, this can be also achieved in paintings such as the works of Claude Monet and Vincent van Gogh. Now, the reason for that is if you were to do a study of these paintings, there isn't a strong contrast with any sort of lighting, nor the local values of the subjects. But if you were to turn these images into black and white, one thing you'll notice is that they take on a certain texture and pattern for the overall readability of the composition. So basically, pattern and texture is a category that shares the element of line. So a big characteristic they all have is that they tend to have this sort of visual noise versus blocks of large shapes, just like the mass and form. So again, in terms of the line element, it is also shared by pattern and texture. However, you're probably wondering how all sorts of visual style, when it comes to general readability, can fit in just three categories. So what we need to understand, just like using three primary colors, like red, yellow, and blue, we can mix these in order to get hundreds of different variations. So just like many well-composed images, they tend to share a few elements in one piece. If we take a look back at the first set, you can see how even in these form-dominant designs, they have a little bit of mass, texture, and line in different parts of the artwork. But the reason these are done by skilled masters is that they are able to simplify and are very aware of how to make a clear design. Now, in the same way, you can mix colors, but if you have them mixed evenly, what will happen is you'll get what's known as muddy colors, where things tend to gray out. So just like mixing these design elements, when you have an equal amount of form, line, and mass, things will be busy and confusing. Now, I don't expect everyone to master these elements in just one term, let alone a week. However, as long as you do the assignment that I'll be giving this week, I know that you will be well equipped to at least recognize these elements whenever you see a great piece of art. So for the next chapter, I'm also going to be giving you an exercise that will help you comprehend this a little bit better.